In this video, we want to consider the effect that salt has on bacterial growth, and then the classifications of organisms that grow in environments with different quantities of salt. So let's start by refreshing our memory related to the details of what happens to cells when they're in environments with different quantities of salt. And so this relates to osmosis. Salt is a really common and important solute in solutions. So any aqueous or water-based environment will have some or no salt in it. And again, salt is an important component of that solution. Salt is particularly important because it will drive the movement of water through osmosis. So we know that if cells, in this case red blood cells, but these could easily be bacterial cells, if cells are in an environment that is isotonic, we know that the solute concentration outside the cells is equal to the solute concentration inside the cells. And in an isotonic environment, some water will leave the cells and some water will enter the cells, but the cells will maintain the same water volume inside the cell. So the cell's not at risk of expanding and potentially rupturing, and it's not at risk of shriveling up through the loss of water. Now, another environment that we could describe is a hypertonic environment. So again, hypertonic just means high solute. So in this environment, the environment around the cell would have a higher salt concentration than the cytoplasm in the cell. And we know that the cytoplasm of cells generally has a concentration, an equivalent salt concentration of about 1%. So any environment with more than 1% salt would be hypertonic. And water will be drawn towards where there's more salt through osmosis, and water will leave the cells. That can result in cells like these red blood cells shriveling, and that would happen to bacterial cells as well. Finally, the last kind of environment a cell could be in is a hypotonic environment. Again, hypo is just low, tonic is solute. So this is an environment where the salt concentration in the environment is less than the salt concentration in the cell. Again, water will move via osmosis to wherever there is more salt. So in this case, there's more salt inside the cells, somewhere around 1%. And this environment would have less than 1% salt. We could consider maybe pure water, no salt. Water will rush into the cells towards where there's more salt. These red blood cells are swelling, and this red blood cell is bursting. We know that bacterial cells also experience this same accumulation of water, but bacterial cells don't burst because they have their strong peptidoglycan cell wall surrounding the bacterial cell, protecting it from lysis. So if we're going to understand the salt concentration in the environments that bacteria thrive in, it's really important that we understand what effect that salt has on osmosis, or the movement of water. And that can explain how and why cells thrive in particular environments. So let's think about different environments, what salt concentration is there, and what kinds of microbes live in those environments. So we're going to do that by looking at this kind of graph. So along the bottom here, I've got the salt percentage ranging from 0% to 20%. And we're going to plot at these different salt percentages, what is the growth rate for some different types of microorganisms. And let's start at the lowest concentration of salt, basically 0%, and think about what kinds of organisms grow best there. So if we were going to classify a group of organisms and how they grow, we could add this line to the graph. So we see an extraordinarily high growth rate at basically 0% salt. And as the salt concentration increases, the growth rate drops to 0, near maybe 1% salt. So these microbes grow best in an environment without salt and can only survive up to maybe 1% salt. And so there are a number of bacteria in the world that fit this exact kind of classification. And any time a bacteria fits this classification, we call it a non-halophiles. So they do not, non-halophiles, like salt. Non-halophiles don't like salt. So they grow best with a 0% salt concentration, and they're killed by any salt concentrations greater than 1%. All right. So if we continue on that path, we can add another line to our graph. So there's another group of bacteria that seem to grow really well around 1% salt. But their growth rate decreases as the salt concentration increases. However, they can survive up to as much as about 10% salt. So again, there's a number of microorganisms like this in the world, and we call these organisms halotolerant organisms. So they grow best with about 1% salt, but they can survive some higher salt concentrations. All right, so far 2 classifications based on the salt concentration in the environment where they grow best and sort of the maximum salt concentration they can survive. We've got non-halophiles, and we've got the halotolerant organisms. So next, we'll consider a group of organisms that grow best, maybe at around 3% salt or so. They can survive at very low salt concentrations, and they can survive at higher salt concentrations, just over 10% or so. But again, their preferred environment is about 3% salt. We're going to call these halophiles, so salt lovers. And again, they grow best with about 3% salt. Again, there are many, many microorganisms that fall into this category. In microbiology, the most common ones would be found living in our oceans. Our ocean has about 3% salt, so these organisms really thrive there. And then a number of these organisms would be growing on our skin as well. Our skin is a particularly salty environment. All right, so we've got the non-halophiles. They don't like salt. They grow best at 0% and can only survive up to 1%. Then we've got the halotolerants. They grow best at 1% and can survive up to 10. Halophiles like it a bit more salty. They prefer 3% and can survive beyond 10%. And then the last group we'll add grows best where all these other organisms begin to die. So they grow at these highest salt concentrations. So from about 10% or so up, they grow best somewhere between 15 and 20% salt. And we call these extreme halophiles. Again, their growth maximizes in environments that are particularly salty, 15 to 20% salt. And so those kinds of environments would be places like salt flats, or anywhere the ocean floods and the water evaporates. It will leave behind a lot of salt, and these kinds of organisms will survive there. So, again, we've got these 4 classifications. And so if we measure or characterize a microbe based on what salt concentrations it grows best at, we should be able to classify it into one of these groups. Before we leave, I just want to leave you with 2 important considerations that you should make about the effect that these microbes' environments have on their survival and what they have to do to be able to survive in those environments. Right? The first one has to do with the low salt environments. So I want to point out that in these low salt hypotonic environments, bacteria are protected against lysis by their cell wall. So again, in a hypotonic environment, any environment that has low salt concentration, water will always be flowing into the cell. One of your cells, like a red blood cell, will burst in those conditions and die. Bacteria often find themselves in hypotonic environments, and they have to be protected from that environment. Again, the protection is their cell wall, which keeps them from lysing. So if we consider the hypotonic environment, bacteria have this protection of their cell wall. What about if we think about the hypertonic environment? So in the hypertonic environment, there's this different problem. Water is always leaving the cell. So any bacteria that thrive in a hypertonic or high salt environment must have a way to replace the water lost from their cells through osmosis. The most likely way to do that is to run active transport pumps to bring water back into the cell to maintain homeostasis, to maintain the correct water concentration inside the cell. So again, cells have to be prepared for the environment they live in. If a cell is going to live in a hypotonic environment, it has to protect itself from lysis. Bacteria do that with cell walls. If a cell is going to live in a hypertonic environment, it has to protect itself from water loss. And we can do that by pumping additional water back into the cell. So we'll end there. I hope that helps your understanding of how salt in the environment affects bacterial growth. As always, if you have any questions about the content, I hope you'll let me know, and I will talk to you all again very soon.